all the people knows that Mr. Piñera was a minister and he made the three main reforms that shape the modern Chile as we know today. The labor reform, the pension system reform, and the mining reform. But a few people knows that Mr. Piñera is the real postino of poeta Pablo Neruda. Because when Mr. Piñera was a student in the United States at the end of the 60s in the past century, his father was ambassador of Chile in New York. Mr. Piñera read an article from a magazine from Chile who was written for Pablo Neruda. And in this article, Pablo Neruda said that one edition of his main opus, Canto General, was translated to English in the United States with the draws from the famous painter Alfredo Siqueiros. And it was a very big book, 1 meter for 1 meter, with beautiful draws, beautiful printed. And Neruda said that anybody can take to Chile this book because it was so big. The planes don't want to take the book. People in the borders stop the book because you can pass through the border with this book. And nobody can take me the book from New York. And Mr. Piñera read the article and goes to the embassy and said, give me the book. I travel to Chile the next week and take the book to the poet. And Mr. Piñera travels 18 hours in the plane with the book over his knees. Imagine, 18 hours with a book. And he arrived at Santiago and goes to Isla Negra, to the house of Mr. Neruda, and gave him the book. And this is the real postino, the real postman of the poet, the most famous poet from Chile. And now he is the most famous reformer of Chile, Mr. Piñera.
Well, thank you, John, very much for that beautiful anecdote. As a matter of fact, I was just paying a debt to Neruda. I am someone who believes in paying its debt. I was an 18-year-old young university student who had, female friends, and I have used Neruda's poems to talk to ladies and to talk to girls. So Neruda has been instrumental in my success in university. So I was just paying my debt and taking him a book. And yes, I did that. I spent a full day there, and we had an extraordinary discussion. And as you all know, he was a communist. But these artists like Picasso and Paul Eluard, who are communists, are cultural communists. They really don't believe in the economic and social and political implications. So there's no problem there. And we talk about poetry, of course, and there's nothing wrong with poetry and economics and all this life. And we should be aware to all those elements. But anyway, The Future of Europe at Stake is the title of this session. Indeed, in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, millions of people and many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were liberated from the tragedy that was the communist governments for 50 years in Europe. So Marx is dead, as we know, except as the joke goes in some American Ivy League universities, you see, like my own Harvard, incidentally. But the tragedy is that after this great triumph of liberty, of freedom, of the West, Europe, and to some extent also the great United States, are going bankrupt. Their governments, the state is going bankrupt. We know every day that the discussion is about huge fiscal deficits, about debts that are reaching 100% of GNP in each country, about Congress that have to approve or not approve the increase in the ceiling debt, about the Maastricht Treaty of Europe being violated by almost every country, even by Germany and France, because they have had at some moments fiscal deficits or public debt to GNP ratios that are above what a treaty like the Maastricht Treaty said. So the West is going bankrupt. Not the private sector, of course, we're talking about the government, the state, but that is very important. It's huge. After all, the fall of Lehman Brothers created such a financial and economic crisis in the world. Imagine the moment when a Western European country were to default on its sovereign debt and go bankrupt. Lehman Brothers would be nothing compared to Spain or France or any country of that size eventually defaulting on its debt. Now, it's very difficult, of course, for those countries to default on its so-called public or sovereign debt. But there is another debt that we economists call the unfunded liability of the entitlement programs. And that is the debt of the governments to its people. That is, the governments of Europe have promised its workers and its citizens a lot of social benefits, especially health. And Kerry gave us a very interesting talk, and pensions, social security. If you calculate the real debt, that is called the unfunded liability, there is a technique to do that, and we have at the Cato Institute a great expert on that who has done it for all European countries and the US. The debt is several times the GNP of each of the Western countries. And whenever those countries decide to reduce the benefits of the workers or increase the retirement age, in a way they are defaulting in a small scale on the promises made to the people. Now, eventually, if that happens in a bigger scale, there will be social chaos and political trouble in this country. We have seen what happened in Detroit, in the US. You see a small city if you want, but the bankruptcy of Detroit has created enormous damage to the city, to the people, even to the self-assurance of a country like the US. Well, some months ago, The Economist had a cover showing not only Detroit, but all the states of the US, Illinois, California, that have also these enormous unfunded liabilities. And finally showing the United States, the federal government, the Social Security system, that The Economist said is a nightmare. The nightmare of pensions at The Economist is just beginning in the West, and it's just beginning in the US. So Marx is dead, but the founder of the modern welfare state, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck from Prussia, is alive and living in Paris, living in Washington, living in Madrid, and of course living in Berlin. Why? Because Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century, for whatever reasons, unifying Germany, we can discuss that, but he created the unfunded system of pensions. Instead of applying common sense and creating a system in which people were incentivized, they are giving incentives to save for old age, as had been generally in history, either through savings directly or through having children, a very good way of securing your old age, if you have enough of them and they survive you. Instead of that, Bismarck created this idea that you could tax and spend. You tax the workers a little and spend the benefits on the retirees. Now, at the time of Bismarck, that was very easy. The average expectancy of life of a Prussian was 45 years old. And he said, whoever arrives to 65, almost nobody, except himself, he arrives, will receive a benefit from the state, so we can charge the workers a very low tax on the use of labor. He created basically the payroll tax, a terrible tax. It's the tax on employing worker. Imagine, when every society should like to have full employment, therefore not have a tax on the use of labor, maybe even an incentive, a subsidy to the use of labor, because we all want full employment. There's almost nothing more important in public policy than to create the conditions of full employment for people in the morning to rise up and go to work and have a decent wage in the private sector. Well, Bismarck created the payroll tax, initially at 1, 2, 3%. Today, in Germany, the total benefit is 42%. So, and in some countries, even 50%. So you hire a worker, and any employer knows that, and you pay the worker 100, but you have to pay another 50. So that is an enormous tax on using labor. And then the elite of Europe is surprised that they have an average unemployment rate of 25%, and in some countries, youth unemployment rate of higher than 50%. Well, but you are taxing the use of labor. No, but you have to tax the use of labor in order to provide the benefits to the elderly, because that is the Bismarckian idea. So, my position clearly is that Bismarck made a horrible mistake, unintentional, of course, but he destroyed the link between contributions and benefits. The contributions are the payroll tax, the benefits are the retirees' pensions. And whenever in history you destroy the link between effort and reward, ultimately, on a large scale, the end result is a disaster, because all the incentives go in the wrong direction. The incentives in Europe are to try to get the political system to give you a premature pension. Every time I go to Paris, you see the train drivers are in a strike because they want to retire at 55, at 53, at 52. Of course, if you could retire early and go fishing or be with your grandchildren while someone else pays taxes in order to finance your early retirement, you do that. So all the incentives of the people are that. And they get that. Every powerful trade union in Europe, held by a monopolistic trade union law. That is another discussion, but I changed the monopolistic trade union law before changing the pension system, because one of the horrible things of the monopolistic trade union laws is not only that it creates unemployment, create a politicized trade union leader, but they have a sort of veto over public policy. So they veto the correct public policies. If you want to liberalize the labor markets, the trade unions say no. And the governments, Spain or France, for example, do not do anything that the trade unions veto. And since they will always veto the liberalization of the labor market, you will have years and maybe decades of very high unemployment. I am always surprised when I am in countries like Spain, and why are not people killing themselves in the streets, you see, with 55%? Now, I have reached the conclusion it is because the black economy, because a lot of people are out of the economy and are one way or another working and trying to survive in a black economy, but there are enormous problems to be in the black economy. But anyway, it is unsustainable to have these rates of unemployment, but those rates of unemployment and the huge public debt have, that is the reason is that Bismarck is alive. So we have to bury Bismarck, maybe along Marx. You see, we can put them both together. And Lenin there in the Kremlin, in front of the Kremlin. Still there, yes, Vladimir is still there. So we in Chile had exactly the same problem 34 years ago. Let me tell you what we did, not in order to say beautiful things about Chile. Of course, I am always glad to do it, but already John did it with Pablo Neruda. I've just showed the Chilean system as an example. Let me be clear. I could make the case also only in abstract terms, but it's more powerful when you go around the world and I meet presidents and prime ministers and so on. I tell them this can be done, and I know it because we have done it successfully. So that is a very powerful message. I have met Clinton and Bush and Putin and Prodi and all the rest. And the first thing they ask is not, don't give me the PhD thesis about this. Tell me how it's done. Tell me which are the problems of the transition, which are the political forces that will oppose you, how we can win the day. Well, in Chile, we had Bismarck in Santiago, to put it some way. And I had this idea that if Bismarck destroyed the link between contributions and benefits, the solution to the problem was very simple. And in that sense, I have always said that intellectually, this is not nuclear physics. I have not discovered anything very difficult. I simply have applied, I believe, common sense in discovering the solution, and then moral courage in implementing it. Of course, that is the most scarce commodity. But the solution is to link benefits and contributions, to create a system in which your pension depends on your savings during your working life. And so we gave every worker the choice that instead of paying the payroll tax to the government system, they could put that payroll tax, not an extra money that the worker doesn't have, but the payroll tax. In America, it's called the FICA tax. Mr. FICA, call it some young people, to direct Mr. FICA, the payroll tax, to an individual retirement account, to an account of your own property, where from 20 years old, if you begin there, you put in Chile 10% of your wage. The number, of course, can be completely different in each country. In Chile, every worker, whenever they enter the labor force, they save 10% of their wage. And they save it every month for 40, 45 years until 65. Well, what is the important thing is that when you have savings over 45 years, you benefit in an extraordinary way from the power of compound interest, from the power of interest building over interest, because you don't take the money out. And the power of compound interest, and every economist and every person knows, it doesn't grow in a linear way, but exponentially. So anyone who begins saving at 20 or 65 will have a capital that will be many, many times the annual salary because of the power of compound interest, as long as the system, of course, is safe and you don't lose the money. And we took extreme care to put safety conditions in the law, to demand a very diversified portfolio. The Chilean pension funds are invested in 10,000 different financial instruments, so that they have in one company is such a tiny percentage that even if Apple were to go bankrupt or China Mobile, I am mentioning companies where the Chilean workers are invested, Samsung, well, the pension fund will not suffer, of course, because it's called portfolio diversification. My mother called it put the eggs in different baskets. It's common sense. Only very greedy people put all their money in one company and then they cry when the company goes bankrupt. But it's obvious that you shouldn't do that. So we have all those safety, and I could go on and on. I have written books and academic articles about that. But the key element is that every worker, in a safe way, in a secure, in a prudent way, save for old age. Everyone builds a nest egg. And so when you reach 65, you don't look to the government. You don't look whether Montoro is in power or Guindos, who is winning the battle of influence in the government, whether the fiscal deficit is this amount or that other, whether Brussels is here, whether the men in black have come to. No. You look at your retirement account and you see that you have a huge capital of your own property that, incidentally, since we're also doing a constitution at the same time, that I am very proud because I signed it, that had brought democracy to my country. In that constitution, we were able to put a protection to the pension funds. So that is not even in the case of war. A president can take the pension fund. He can issue bonds, and the pension fund may buy or not if the rate of return is okay. But they cannot confiscate the pension funds. That's why for 34 years we have had 7 different governments, from the left, the center, the right, and no one politicians that we know generally are quite opportunist and try to take out others people's money because they are very greedy when they see a lot of money accumulated in the pension fund, but they have not been capable of confiscating 1 peso or 1 euro of our pension funds, because it's protected by the Constitution, by the law, and by the people, because the people know every month how much money they have, and it's very difficult to steal from the people the money from the checking account. You can steal by creating entitlements that are complex and people don't understand, but you cannot steal from your checking account or your savings account. So the system has worked for 34 years. It's called a capitalization system. I prefer to call it a system of personal retirement account because it applies to the common sense of everyone. After all, we all save to buy a house. Young people save to buy a bicycle, whatever. So saving for your retirement. Now, of course, the government has to have a supervision of the citizens so that there is no Mr. Madoffs around.
But you see, Mr. Madoff was not precisely in a pension system in Chile. We have never had a Mr. Madoff in Chile. We cannot have a Mr. Madoff in Chile because we have a lot of supervision, better than the Securities and Exchange Commission of the US that allow Mr. Madoff. But Mr. Madoff basically ran a system like a Bismarckian system, a Ponzi scheme. There's a famous cartoon that, I don't know whether you have seen it, that the police are interrogating Mr. Madoff. And they're saying, Mr. Madoff, from where you got this idea of paying the people with the money of the last one? And he said, well, from the Social Security of the US, from the Bismarckian system. And it is in French, from the French répartition, whatever, the country. But Mr. Madoff got the idea from the Social Security system. Basically, it's called also a Ponzi scheme. There was an Italian, Mr. Ponzi, who discovered this very easy way to make money, but it's a fraud. So, as I say, this system works. This system goes with common sense. This system creates the right incentives. That is the key element. You see, any Chilean, even the most humble one who has a personal retirement account, understand that if he puts more money in the account, he or she, they will have a better pension. So your pension depends on your savings. What a concept more simple. If you work more, you get a better pension. If you put voluntary saving, we have a system with some tax incentive to put voluntary saving. Some people are very much afraid of old age, and some people want to save more for old age. Some people are not afraid of old age and want to go more to restaurants in the week, you see. Well, you allow for different individual preference to translate into different actions. And the government, as I said, provides market-friendly supervision. And I created a special technical and very honest body to look at this because, of course, the system will not survive Mr. Madoff in Chile. And second, the government provides a safety net. There are some people in society, 5, 10, 15, 20% that maybe will not be able to save during their life, and therefore will arrive at 65 without enough capital. And we will not allow in Western societies for people to starve simply because they didn't save. So we create, of course, a safety net, but focused on 10, 20% of the population, not on 100% of the population, financed by general tax revenues, not by a system of pay-as-you-go created by Bismarck. So we buried Bismarck in Chile completely. We replaced completely the system. And the system has been working for 34 years. The funds have accumulated $200 billion, that is 70% of GDP. So instead of having a 70% debt, we have a 70% assets in Chile. The government has no pension debt, on a little pension debt of the retirees that are going away because finance ministers, of course, enjoy a little the fact that we all have to go to meet our creator. So that the retirees are going to heaven or to hell, and the finance minister pays less people the pension because the pensions of the young people are being paid by the 16% retirement account. So eventually the Chilean government will not have to pay pensions. And then it can invest in hospitals, in roads, in justice, and whatever else. So the system of pensions in every country in the world is the largest single government program. In the US, it's 24% of the federal budget, higher than the military spending of the US. So the fact that the system that is 24% of the federal budget is going bankrupt in the US or in France is huge. So I believe this system can be done. We can discuss all the details, the transitions. The important thing is to understand the concept. The concept is that we have turned every worker into an owner of financial capital. Ultimately, every worker into a small capitalist. When everyone is a small capitalist, in the good sense of the word, owning property, they care about the well-being of the country, of the economy. They don't elect demagogues. They behave more rationally, and that's why we also have a lot of political stability in the last years. So the system works, and I'm completely sure about that, and I do believe it's the solution for Europe. Now, how do we introduce it? It has to be introduced at the national level, probably gradually, probably not in the way we did in Chile, where we did the full reform in one law. You can even begin, and someone was asking me yesterday in Spain, well, but Spain has a huge fiscal deficit now. Well, you may begin by allowing, for example, the young people less than 30 years old to choose. You can always give them the choice to stay in the government system at their own risk, that is going backwards, or to allow, or to move to a system of personal retirement account, to put their payroll tax into a new system. So in that sense, the transition will take 40, 50 years, but anyway. In that case, the cost, the fiscal cost is very, very low, but you give an enormous signal to the citizens of the capital markets of the world who immediately will react for any European country that will initiate a system of capitalization that it will eventually replace the bankrupt Bismarck system. Now, we are, and I finish with this, we are in Catalonia, so let me make one special point. Of course, I cannot comment out of respect for Spain and for Catalonia and this debate that you have on whether independence or no independence, that is beyond my reach. But I was discussing with Joy in the train about this, and I had the idea that is the extra benefit of a system like this, that if eventually Catalonia were to go for independence, in a system of personal retirement account, that issue completely is out of the problem, because even if eventually Scotland or Catalonia were to go for independence, they will have to divide in some way the unfunded liabilities of the pension system. Because of course, who will pay the retirees? Unless the proportions of active workers in each region are the same, probably not. There is also another huge problem there. Now, in a system of personal retirement accounts, that problem is solved automatically. For example, I have helped other 28 countries to do this, of course, but specifically our neighbors, Peru and Colombia and Mexico, and I have met the presidents and the ministers, and Peru has a system like the Chilean one. So now, for example, Chile is investing a lot in Peru, all the companies are in Peru and so on. Peru is booming now. But when an executive in Chile, and I met the other day one, moved from Chile to Peru, he only asked his private manager of the pension fund to move his fund from the Chilean pension manager to the Peruvian pension manager. But there's no, that is done in a click almost. And maybe now they have the same manager because some companies, Banco de Santander, BBV, even Spanish Principal, MetLife, are in all these countries. Because we have, so in the system of personal retirement accounts, improves social mobility across regions, across countries, and diffuses the problem of one national system, especially if it is going back. So anyway, my last message is this can be done. It's not easy, it's very difficult. Of course, as every important thing in life, it's difficult. But it can be done, and I hope that Europe will move in this direction, because the world needs, of course, a solvent Europe, a strong Europe, allied to the United States that have done so much good in the 20th century, and it should be the same thing in the 21st century. So thank you very much.
We have 10 minutes to solve questions.
At the end of the day, I think that the real problem behind that is how do you really make the government to act on this? Because I believe the issue of the technical solution, you have had very good technical solution and reliable solution, but how do you move the government to act? How do you rock the vested interest? Because with this system, the government has all this amount of money that they get in labor taxes, they play with this money, and this gives them a lot of power. So, changing this at the end means that they're losing the power to handle this money, and there are so many vested interests. And the question is, how do you make them change? Because there are going to be many people behind says, "Oh, you are playing against, equality, and against the welfare state, because then the rich are not going to be contributing." All this, talk that there is going on. So I think that the question for me, from my point of view, at least, is how do you make government?
Well, very good question. Of course, that is the essence of the problem of being a reformer. You see, this is not easy, I say. But I can tell you immediately, apart of all the arguments, that we have been able to do it. You may not know, but Peru has the system under a Japanese-Peruvian president. So, because if only Chile had it, you could say, well, only long and narrow countries. And for 10 years, I traveled the world explaining the Chilean system, and people were saying, "Oh, well, Chile, Neruda, long and narrow, earthquakes. That's so good." Or the president who dresses in some way. You see. Then we went to Peru, a Japanese engineer and president. We did in Peru. And then we went to Colombia, incidentally, with Karen Santos, with my friend Santos and Libre, no, and we did it in Colombia. And then in Mexico, Cedillo, Fox, each very different. And then we crossed to Poland and Slovakia. So, first of all, it can be done not only in long and narrow countries, very important. Second, now, what you do is the power of ideas. So you're absolutely right, there are vested interests. We will always have to fight vested interests. That is life, so let's not cry. But the weakness of vested interests is that they cannot express their interest in public. You see, the dirty little secret of vested interest is that they work through intrigue, through lobby, in the palace, but they cannot go on television and say, I have a vested interest. No, they cannot. So I challenge the vested interest to the television, to the press, to public opinion. Now we have internet, we have Twitter. John Miller is the king of Twitter here. We have so many ways to challenge the vested interest, to show that a politician don't want to do the reform because he manages, as you said very well, the power, but that, again, he cannot defend. Is the interest that cannot be defended publicly. So if you are willing and you have the courage to go and confront them in a friendly way, I don't have enemies, I have not been killed, you see, by Bismarck or Bismarck's followers, thank God, because that's a problem, of course. But as long as there is no physical violence, I have debated all over the world this idea. I have debated in the US with US senators. And if you debate, don't underestimate the power of ideas, because the system benefits the majority. In a democracy where everyone votes, you will win the day against the vested interest. So you're right, you have to confront it. That's why it's not easy. No, otherwise, my children will be doing this. You see, I leave all the easiest tasks to my children. I do only the very difficult ones, because those are the beautiful ones in life. But it can be done. With ideas, with courage, with communication. But for that you need leaders, of course. You need someone in the parliament in Spain or but sometimes when crises arise, leaders emerge. You had in the US the great Ronald Reagan, you see, the new dawn in America. You had Thatcher, I have met Thatcher. I was invited by Thatcher to the UK in 1981. Before the Falklands War, before she dared to do the big things. Well, there was a leader there. And there have been other leaders. There was Uribe in Colombia that I admire very much. Well, I don't want to drop names, but they are at exceptional moment leaders. And the important thing is to have the idea in the table, to have the option there. That's why conference like this organized by Barbara Coleman, 30 cities in these times, are so important. You see, you have to have the solution in the table. Now maybe today nothing can be done in Spain. Today nothing can be done with François Hollande and Ségolène Royal. No, nothing. But eventually, the goals are a Thatcher, an Adenauer, a Reagan. And then you have to have the idea.
Jose, may I just add to the gentleman's question how you implemented it? Because I know that you used a lot of public media, you appeared in TV shows, and how you really practically convinced the Chilean public to vote for your system.
Well, yes, but that will be different, Barbara, in each country. I will tell you the anecdote, but it's anecdotal, because in each country it will be different. And today we have internet, we have so many other YouTube, Twitter. But anyway, in my country, remember, it was 34 years ago. You were in kindergarten, maybe, I don't know. But
I wish
no, I went to television. I noticed that FDR did it with the radio, to radio effect. In my time it was television. And so, if you want the anecdote, I use it many ways, but one way I went once a week to the prime news 3 minutes. I discovered that is common sense. That nobody wants to hear the Minister of Labor, even if he's young, whatever, and eloquent, more than 3 minutes. And there is the remote control, you see. The only one who has win over remote control is Fidel Castro, who has vanished. If you have remote control, you are killed, because that way he can speak 4 hours. But those of us who cannot do that have to contend with remote control. So the man in the bed, you see, because people are trying to use in bed, they can click and you're out. So I went on TV and said, I will speak to you 3 minutes. I even It's famous in Chile. I went with an egg timer and I put it in front of me. A measure of a symbol of humility. And I said to the cameraman, after the 3 minutes, cut me out. That is showbiz. So I said, I will tell I am the Minister of Labor and Security. I remember the first time I have the bad news and the good news. The bad news is very clear. The system of pension is banned. And I know because I manage it. I am the man in charge. It's an atomic bomb. Regrettable, it's not my fault. The system is banned. And I am a Harvard PhD, a professor, come on. I know. So I will use only one program to tell you we are in trouble. Well, next week at this time I will tell you the solution. That is the good news. Next time I came with a savings account that my mother had opened us when we were 4 years old or whatever. And if you save, you increase your money. So what about if we save for 45 years? Now you will say you don't have money. Well, I will allow you to put the payroll tax there. Next week, how will we save? And I came to the TV with 10 baskets and 10 eggs. And then I said, this is portfolio diversification. If one basket goes down and I threw it, you have the other 9. Well, it would be not 10, it would be 10,000. And a year doing this, like a soap opera, like a telenovela. But a telenovela about your life, about your future, from a minister. And then a lot of the cabinet, the first day I measured this to the cabinet, they said, you must be crazy, you have been too much time in Harvard, too many cappuccinos. The cabinet. But after 4 or 5 months, the cabinet ministers were coming to me and they were saying, our wives are saying that your system is very interesting. And the mothers-in-law are very important. The mothers-in-law are with you. And eventually even the president, when a lot of that, the presidents are worried about what in that case it was about world communism, blah, blah. And the press came around, they all came around because you get the power of idea. Now you have to explain the idea. You have to keep it simple. Not like all this complementary pension system that you have in Spain, in the UK. Nobody understands anything. I even read I don't understand. The little no. Keep it simple. I showed the personal account. So I have done this in the Latin world. This can be, I did it in Colombia, I did it in Mexico, I did it in Peru, I did it in El Salvador, I did it in Uruguay. So, but anyway, come on, this is not me. It's about an idea. I believe in the key is I believe in the power of ideas well communicated. That's why I admire Reagan on that. I admire FDR. FDR, I like some of his policies, but FDR was a genius. I even admire Clinton on that. That's why I spent a lot of time trying to influence the Clinton government. I was invited to the Clinton White House Summit on Social Security. Larry Summers and Gene Sperling were working in this direction until Clinton lost his way. Prefer other treasures of life rather than leave a legacy. They prefer leaving a legacy. But Clinton could have done it. Clinton going on TV explaining this. He's a genius. He can explain bad ideas. Imagine how he could be with good ideas.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Piñera, one is that the countries you mentioned as examples are all countries, non-Western countries like Latin America or Eastern Europe. And so I wonder if the conditions there maybe are quite different from here, where we already have a huge system already built and people believing in it from many, many years, and maybe not in those countries where the system was not so huge and you had younger population, so transition costs were lower. And the other quick question is, what if I want to opt out of your system because your system is private-based, but it's compulsory? What if I want to opt out?
Okay, I answered the 2 questions. The first one, don't believe that because something is huge, people believe it is. It's totally the contrary. It is huge, for example, in Spain, but everyone now is in Spain. I have been talking to taxi drivers that the pensions are being decreased by the government due to the crisis, and that every expert meeting that there is about pension, it means another decrease in the benefit. That is, Spain is facing the next 10 years, where you will see each year the real value after inflation of pension going down. So I don't believe that people believe in the system. I don't know from where you have that idea. I don't believe that if someone goes on television in Spain and say the current system is a fraud because the pensions are going down, because the politicians decided to bring down, people are not happy with what is happening on pensions. Pensions have already decreased in Spain, not to mention in Greece. And eventually you will see France, and you will see her. No. People don't believe. Now, we have done it also in developed countries. I didn't mention it waiting for your question. But Australia, you know Australia? It's a huge developed country. Australia has the Chilean system completely. In 1992, Australia introduced, they call it the superannuation system, and it's very successful. We introduced it in Hong Kong, a country, and I have great hope that from Hong Kong we will go to China. Now it's very special Hong Kong. And we introduced a small element of this system in Sweden, of all places. I received in Chile the Swedish Riksdag delegation, and they have 2.5% of salary that go to a private retirement account. Now still they have the pay-as-you-go as the big system, and they have turned to notional accounts, but they have a small element of Chilean system. Now, not the big countries of Europe, because the big countries, but it's not because they believe the system was successful, it's because no leader dare to tell the truth to the people and tell them that the system is going bankrupt and that there are solutions. But time is on my side, you see, because you know all the demographics, and every year people will understand better that the old system is bankrupt. And every year the Chilean system and the Peruvian and the Mexican will have a better track record of more years, so time is on our side. Now, if you have a leader, you shorten the time, and you can do it before the crisis, before the abyss. And that's what I am trying to do, and that's why I go around the world. So regrettably, until there is a cultural change in the West, that will take time, because we have had a system where people thought that the state was responsible. So you cannot change culture from one day to the other. I also had in my team a young libertarian like you would say, why don't we simply say anyone do whatever it wants? Be careful. You do not reform the world doing things like that. You may have an intellectual joy, but you cannot success, because that will never happen, cannot happen. We did polls, how many people would save if totally voluntarily, and 3% will save. 3% of Germans and Swiss in Chile will save. No Latin will save. Because they have had 60 years where the state financed the pension. Now, I do believe, and here I am with you, I hope that I will live to the time, another 30 years, I am young, I don't smoke, I keep a healthy life, and one day, maybe in Chile, after 60 years in which everyone had saved in this system, we will one day say, okay, now it's not mandatory save, but then you will have changed the culture. But you cannot go from a Bismarckian paternally, because there is something called culture. You don't change culture over a day. And if you believe you can do it that way, you ultimately are a failed reformer, you see. And you do a reform, you create a lot of damage to the people, you create a lot of pain, and finally you don't do anything. So this is a minor departure from total freedom that would be giving everyone the possibility of not saving. But you give them so many other freedoms: freedom to choose the retirement age, freedom to choose how much you save, freedom to choose how you take out the money at the end. I have not got into all these details. So you go 90% of the road, if you want. And the other 10% will be when people learn personal responsibility, when politicians all over the world speak of personal responsibility, and not every day about giving a subsidy, giving a benefit, that is the language of politicians, is giving something. Instead of asking people to be responsible, asking for effort, as Churchill, the great Churchill, did, you see. When that changes, if it changes, we lift that little mandatory thing. It's a detail. I take 1 minute lifting that. But in the meantime, let's allow people to have this system where there are a lot of other incentives to voluntarily personal responsibility, because most people save more than the mandatory, and most people find other ways to exercise it. So it's a legitimate question, but this is a realistic answer from someone who has done a reform that is working and has done for 34 years.